Welcome Beyond the Text by 6-7.
Today we're doing something a little different.
We are. We're not just, reading through some dusty old texts. Think of this more as a critical reverse engineering project.
Right. We're trying to get to the source code.
Exactly. We are cracking open the hard drive of early belief itself. Our mission today is a high-speed, really intensive journey through the first 5 centuries of the Christian tradition. And we're going to be analyzing the raw, unfiltered source material from this amazing collection, Prayers of the Early Church.
And this collection is just fantastic because it arranges everything chronologically. You get the direct, devotional language of foundational Christianity.
You do. From the high-stakes, personal appeals of Christ and the apostles, through the really fervent declarations of the martyrs, all the way up to the sweeping intellectual struggles of figures like Augustine.
So we're really analyzing the core architecture of their theism. What did these people actually believe about God, about truth, and human purpose when they were speaking directly to the divine?
And crucially, we want to understand why. Why this ultimate, deeply theistic reliance was, for them, utterly non-negotiable. This wasn't abstract philosophy at the beginning. For the first believers, this was their operational system. It was about survival and meaning.
And that contrast is why this deep dive is so essential for you, the listener. You're looking for fast, thorough knowledge. And these prayers, they offer a direct line. It's like a shortcut past centuries of theological commentary, straight to that source code of faith.
We're looking for the foundational definition of God that launched a world religion. And in doing that, we're going to draw a really clear contrast with modern existential questions or even atheistic viewpoints.
Definitely. By detailing a life built entirely on divine reliance, where truth is objective and it's outside the self, we gain this structured insight into the bedrock definition of theism. And it details why the earliest church concluded that meaning. Well, it can't be internally manufactured. It has to be received.
Okay, let's unpack this by starting at the absolute beginning, the first century.
Ground zero.
Exactly. When we look at the prayers recorded in the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles, they are so intensely personal, and they're almost always recorded at these crucial, high-stakes moments.
They're not calm, structured liturgies yet. Not at all.
No. They're spontaneous outbursts of profound realization, or in some cases, ultimate submission.
Which is what makes them so incredibly valuable as primary source material. They're not trying to impress an audience. They're communicating an urgent need or a profound commitment.
A great example of this is early prophetic vision is Simeon's prayer in the book of Luke. His desire is for peaceful rest. He says, "Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, for mine eyes have seen thy salvation."
And what's truly striking there and what reveals the depth of their theism is what he doesn't ask for.
Exactly. The request isn't for more time or wealth or power, the typical things we might pray for today. The ultimate request is for closure.
Closure based on witness.
Yes. He had seen the divine promise fulfilled, the salvation prepared for all people. The mission, as he defined it, was accomplished, so he could rest.
It's a complete inversion of a utilitarian purpose. His life's value was derived entirely from bearing witness to an objective, divine event outside of himself. Once that witness was complete, his life achieved its ultimate meaning.
It roots their definition of salvation not in some abstract feeling, but in a specific historical event.
And that sets a powerful standard for human purpose right from the start, witnessing divine action.
So if Simeon provides that sense of peaceful fulfillment, Mary's prayer, the Magnificat, gives us the other side. This fiercely articulate definition of God's nature based on justice and mercy.
This is where theism roots itself in radical societal justice right at the outset.
It really is. Mary is essentially articulating a divine mandate for social upheaval. She declares that God is actively engaged in reversing the world's established hierarchies.
The divine nature is expressed in immediate corrective action. He hath scattered the proud. He hath put down the mighty from their seats and exalted them of low degree.
This isn't passive spirituality or, quiet contemplation.
No, this is revolutionary theology. It defines God as the ultimate breaker of established, unjust power structures.
And that active, intervening God, a deity who doesn't tolerate pride or entrenched power, that must have been fundamentally necessary to sustain believers living under the crushing weight of the Roman Empire.
Absolutely. It offers a promise of ultimate objective justice beyond any earthly court.
But then we have to reconcile that radicalism with the core relationship structure, which is defined by absolute submission.
Right, and we see that established supremely in Jesus' prayer in Gethsemane.
This is maybe the most important architectural feature of early theism. The moment of maximum agony recorded in Matthew's Gospel. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt.
That one phrase. It's the gravitational center of the believer's relationship with God.
It really is.
It establishes obedience to a transcendent, objective will as the defining, non-negotiable characteristic. When we analyze this early Christian theism, we realize this faith demands the total subjugation of the individual's personal desires to a divine design.
It's the ultimate counter-argument to the modern pursuit of complete self-autonomy.
It redefines human freedom, not as the absence of constraint, but as the voluntary alignment with a higher objective constraint. You find purpose by letting go of your own plan and embracing the divine blueprint.
But this submission is immediately tested to the absolute extreme on the cross itself.
And there we see two distinct poles of Christ's prayer there. They define the reach of divine compassion and the depth of complete trust.
So first, there's that incredible compassion for the adversary. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
And second, the ultimate surrender in death. Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit.
That level of forgiveness for the executioner, combined with absolute surrender at the moment of physical annihilation, it establishes the entire theology of suffering and intercession.
It sets the standard. If Christ could intercede for his torturers, then that's the standard for all believers facing persecution.
Which is picked up immediately by the first martyr, Stephen.
Right. His dying words are a direct address to Christ, requesting the reception of his spirit, and mirroring Christ, asking for forgiveness for his executioners. Lord, lay not this sin to their charge.
It solidifies martyrdom not as a tragic political event.
No, it becomes an act of powerful, forgiving intercession. It transforms their suffering into a divine contribution.
So here's where it gets really interesting for me, because we move so abruptly from these dramatic, event-driven prayers of the Gospels and Acts to the deep theological intellect of Paul.
The shift is huge.
It's a dramatic shift in focus. He's not asking for a miracle cure for his chronic suffering or even an escape from prison. He's asking for profound, expansive knowledge for his congregations.
Yes, Paul's prayers show us that for the early church, faith wasn't just an emotional state or some kind of legal transaction. It was an intense intellectual quest. It was focused on the community's spiritual depth, moving way beyond immediate temporal needs.
In Ephesians, for instance, the request is hyper-focused on cognitive and relational growth. He prays for the spirit of wisdom and revelation in the knowledge of him, and for the eyes of your understanding being enlightened.
So the core pursuit of faith becomes an intellectual and relational expansion, a massive, ongoing cognitive challenge.
And the goal, Paul says, is to grasp the incomprehensible, to comprehend what is the breadth and length and depth and height, and to know the love of Christ which passeth knowledge. I'm still reeling from that idea.
It's immense.
It's an immense four-dimensional metric for understanding the divine. It suggests God is a conceptual reality so vast that human understanding has to continually stretch into new dimensions just to approach it.
It absolutely defines the core pursuit of early theism as an endless, ever-deepening endeavor. It rejects the idea that God can be easily contained or, domesticated.
Or just cataloged in a creed.
Right. God is the infinite, and the pursuit of God is an infinite journey. And the result of pursuing this depth is to be filled with all the fullness of God, which means the ultimate human potential is achieved only through an external divine fullness, not by perfecting your own inherent human traits.
But this pursuit of intellectual depth is just. It's inextricably linked to radical suffering. The adapted prayers from the epistles make it so clear that endurance was required.
The early church had no illusions. Persecution was a guarantee.
Indeed. The adapted prayer from Philippians states it plainly. The prayer is not just for the strength to believe, but also to suffer for his sake.
It integrates suffering right into the divine relationship itself. It transforms adversity from a potential sign of abandonment or weakness into an integrated step toward ultimate salvation. It completely flips the script on pain.
And the compensation for the suffering is explicitly non-temporal. It's not of this world. The prayer from 1 Peter sets the expectation of an inheritance incorruptible reserved in heaven.
And that's the foundational reason their conviction was so uncompromising. If your value system is fundamentally detached from earthly decay or temporal reward, then the threat of death or imprisonment or financial ruin, it loses its power.
That detachment is the necessary ethical and psychological framework for survival in a hostile world. If your true treasure is reserved in heaven,
Then Caesar can't touch it.
yeah,
This is pure, uncompromising theism defining its own terms of engagement with the temporal world.
Okay, so now, moving outside the New Testament writings but staying in that critical first century, the prayers of Clement of Rome introduce this incredibly pragmatic side to the early church.
Yes, and they reveal the immediate need to establish a political posture that, on the surface, seems to contradict Mary's revolutionary theology.
That's the exact friction we need to explore. You would logically expect these early Christians who believed God puts down the mighty to be actively revolutionary.
But Clement's prayers for rulers are surprisingly pragmatic. They ask God to grant rulers health, peace, concord, and stability, so they may exercise their authority without offense.
It's a very sophisticated geopolitical position. So how do we reconcile Mary's declaration that God scatters the proud with Clement's prayer for the stability of those proud, often brutal rulers?
The difference is in the theological source of their authority. Clement's prayer explicitly shows this early recognition of political authority as a power given by God.
Ah, gave us the power of the kingdom.
Exactly. Therefore, resistance isn't just political resistance, it's resistance to a divinely established order. They commit to non-resistance in not resisting thy will. Their goal is stability, not revolution,
Why? Why stability?
because stability allows them to practice their faith freely and pursue that spiritual expansion Paul was praying for.
So the goal isn't to seize earthly power, but to neutralize the external environment so they can focus on internal transformation.
Precisely. That focus on civil stability lets the internal spiritual life flourish, which leads us to the daily devotion outlined in the Syrian Clementine liturgy.
And this liturgy focuses on defining that inner spiritual alignment. It asks God, the unsearchable abyss of peace, to make them children of quietness and heirs of peace, and to enkindle the fire of thy love.
So the external world can be harsh, volatile, whatever, but the inner world, the heart, the mind, the will, that must be completely purified and aligned with this objective external source of peace.
That blend of external pragmatism and internal fervor really defines the first century. They accepted the political reality while rigorously demanding an ultimate spiritual standard, which sets the stage perfectly for the next phase.
The crucible of persecution.
Which brings us right into section 2. This is where the commitment to this foundational theism is tested by life or death decisions.
The 2nd and 3rd century documents. They capture the ultimate, most demanding affirmation of God, choosing death over denial.
This is the radical theology of martyrdom. Polycarp, one of the earliest recorded martyrs, in his dying prayer, he doesn't just tolerate death, he thanks God for being allotted a portion among the number of martyrs.
Death is seen as acceptance into everlasting life, and the death itself is hailed as an acceptable sacrifice.
Think about the profound psychological necessity this provided. When you're facing torture and death, you need a spiritual mechanism that turns the worst possible outcome into the best possible outcome.
This theology redefines death as a coronation, not a defeat.
But then Ignatius takes this philosophical leap even further. His prayer isn't passive acceptance, but an active, almost ecstatic desire for martyrdom. He prays for the privilege of martyrdom.
He had to passionately argue for the right to suffer.
And the key insight in Ignatius is the absolute distinction he draws between the temporal and the eternal. He asserts, very philosophically, nothing that appeareth is eternal. For the things which are perceived are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal.
Let's pause on that for a moment. He's stating a fundamental dualism. If something is temporal, it decays. It is fundamentally unreliable.
But if something is eternal, that is true reality.
Precisely. And that philosophical move is the necessary prerequisite for radical sacrifice. If the visible world, your life, your body, your career, is inherently decaying and temporary, then the loss of that life is negligible compared to the gain of the eternal unseen reality.
It makes the ultimate sacrifice a logical conclusion, not an emotional breakdown. It's an investment strategy focused entirely on incorruptible assets.
And his analogy is visceral, almost shocking, but profoundly theological.
I am the grain of God ground between the teeth of wild beasts, that I may be found to be the pure bread of Christ.
That absolute dedication redefines human value through sacrifice. The human body is just. It's feedstock for the divine reality. It establishes the ultimate, uncompromising nature of their theistic conviction. It's a severe test for any belief system.
And it stands as a profound challenge to any modern philosophy that prioritizes the self and self-preservation above all else. For them, self-preservation of the soul was found in the self-offering of the body.
Right, so following this intense period of persecution where belief was constantly being tested externally, we see the rise of formal liturgies in the 2nd and 3rd centuries.
And this demonstrates the institutionalization of the internal struggle, a systematic approach to spiritual purity and introspection.
This internal cleansing becomes just as rigorous as the external test of martyrdom. The Liturgy of St. James, for example, has this detailed list of the internal enemies of the soul. It shows the incredibly high and rigorous ethical standard required.
It's a spiritual audit sheet.
Exactly. And the audit sheet is exhaustive. It targets the hidden corners of the mind and heart directly. They pray against all evil imaginations, all impurity of thought, all inclinations to lust, all depravity of conception.
All envy, pride, and hypocrisy, all falsehood, deceit, and irregular living.
The scope covers every single dimension of human failing: action, word, mind, and thought.
And that level of detail highlights a profound belief that human nature is so thoroughly flawed that even the moment a thought is conceived, it requires continuous divine correction and intervention.
It strongly reinforces that foundational dependence on God, rather than on innate human goodness or some kind of stoic self-discipline.
So spiritual purity is essential. But what's the purpose of that purification? Clement of Alexandria, praying to the teacher, he gives us the answer.
The goal, according to Clement, is seeking divine instruction to perfect the likeness of the image. It illustrates that the purpose of a believer's life is progressive spiritual transformation toward a known, benevolent deity.
So life isn't about self-discovery. It's about transformation into a pre-existing perfect image.
And crucially, this transformation is tied to external accountability. It reinforces the objective nature of their morality. The prayer from Barnabas speaks so clearly about stewardship.
Recognizing that gifts and talents are not self-owned.
No, they're entrustest me with, and they require a good account of stewardship when the great judge shall appear. This accountability reinforces the idea that moral behavior isn't relative or self-defined. It's a measure of how you manage the resources entrusted to you by the great judge.
It moves the discussion far beyond personal ethics into cosmic jurisprudence.
Exactly. So moving into the 3rd century, the liturgies formalized God's role as the active deliverer, focusing on protection and illumination against darkness, both external and internal. The imagery is just so powerful.
The Liturgy of St. Mark is particularly rich here. God is explicitly addressed as the God of light, Father of life, who brings believers up from the depths of darkness to light and is the haven of the shipwrecked.
And that confirms the utter reliance narrative we've been discussing. The believer is fundamentally lost, endangered, and helpless, a shipwrecked soul, and God is the only safe, objective harbor, not a lifeboat they build themselves.
This deliverance narrative defines their relationship with God. He is the one who setteth the captives free, who giveth hope to the hopeless and help to the helpless.
It makes the relationship intensely practical, a continuous cycle of rescue and sustenance, not a one-time philosophical decision.
And this continuous need for rescue, it manifests in the daily morning prayer of St. Mark. It demonstrates the pervasive belief that human effort alone is insufficient against sin and temptation.
They pray daily to drive away from us all envy, all fear, and all temptations, and to forgive sins committed in thought, word, or deed.
It's this acknowledgement that they're fighting a constant spiritual war. They need divine strength daily to counteract the innate wickedness they perceive in their own nature. They pray, take away from us the sinful and wicked influence of carnal desire.
This inability to manage their own thoughts and desires is a recurring theme, and it directly challenges humanistic philosophies that assume autonomous self-control. For the early church, control comes from outside the self.
And it goes further. Spiritual understanding itself is seen as a gift.
Yes, the Eastern Church liturgy contains a plea to shine into our hearts, O loving Master, by the pure light of the knowledge of thyself. This confirms that spiritual illumination is a direct supernatural gift from God. It's revelation, not a human intellectual achievement.
Revelation over pure reason. That's a key distinction in theistic thought at the time. Knowledge of the divine comes via divine intervention, which naturally leads us into section 3.
Right, where the greatest theological figures begin to formalize these concepts. They move beyond immediate need into the deep philosophical and majestic abstract conceptualization of God in the 4th and 5th centuries.
And the language. It becomes exponentially grander. It reflects the political shift as Christianity moves from a persecuted minority to an accepted, if not dominant, force.
Look at Basil's prayers in the 4th century. God is no longer just the Savior. He is the uncreate and primal light, thou sea of bounty, and fathomless deep of loving kindness.
These are titles designed not just to comfort, but to communicate infinite magnitude and benevolence. They're appealing to the philosophical mind of the late Roman Empire.
And the prayer asks for God to shine in our hearts, true Son of righteousness, and fill our souls with thy beauty. This links God directly to the source of all aesthetic and spiritual perfection. This focus on beauty and light is critical.
God is the necessary prerequisite for any true goodness or clarity. The search for truth is inseparable from the search for beauty.
And Ambrose, one of the four great doctors of the Latin Church and a contemporary of Basil, he zeroes in on God's absolute sovereignty over human sin and moral failure. He focuses on the swift, unilateral power of the divine. He asks Christ to command freedom. Loose thee from thy chains, come out of the bonds of thy sins.
That is immense confidence in the instantaneous power of the divine word. I have to ask, does this emphasis on sovereign, immediate freedom mean early belief discounted human effort entirely? Where is the balance between divine command and human responsibility?
That is the central paradox they wrestled with. In Ambrose's expression, the focus is on the impossibility of human effort to truly succeed alone. Since sin is a chain, a bond, only the creator of the universe has the authority and power to unilaterally snap that chain.
So it's about instant transformation commanded by a sovereign deity, not incremental self-improvement.
Exactly. The human responsibility, according to this view, is the recognition of one's own helplessness and the readiness to receive that instantaneous freedom.
And during this period, we also see the maturing understanding of the complex, boundless nature of God, the doctrine of the Trinity.
Yes, in the prayers of Nurses of Clayes, he explicitly calls the Holy Spirit very God and asks for purification with divine fire. This shows the intellectual commitment to defining God not just relationally but ontologically, as three persons in one nature. The concept of God is expanding to contain mystery and complexity.
Moving past a simplistic monotheism.
Exactly. But the deepest psychological and philosophical foundations for this comprehensive theistic belief, they come from Augustine of Hippo in the late 4th century.
His prayers are arguably the most influential in defining the absolute necessity of God, not just for salvation, but for existence itself.
Augustine provides the philosophical and existential bedrock that gives theism its lasting power. We have to start with his famous declaration in the Confessions. Thou madest me for thyself, and my heart is restless until repose in thee.
That single sentence, it defines the human condition as inherently flawed and incomplete without the divine. It's the ultimate anti-atheistic or anti-secular argument. It asserts that the deep, pervasive human sense of restlessness, anxiety, and meaninglessness is not a temporary flaw to be solved by, better social programs or psychological techniques.
No, it's an objective, inherent void built into our design, the God-shaped hole, as that concept is famously summarized. Augustine posits that searching for ultimate completion in temporary things, in career, relationships, pleasure, self-actualization, is a futile operation. It's a fundamental design incompatibility. You need the original operating system to stop crashing.
And his adoration is built around what we can call the divine paradox, this recognition of a God who is both infinitely powerful and perfectly intimate.
He marvels at the God who so carest for every one of us as if thou carest for him alone, and so for all as if all were but one.
This is the critical definition of an infinitely powerful, transcendent deity who is simultaneously perfectly intimate and present to every single person without diminishing the care for any other. It demands both massive awe and deep personal trust.
Augustine then famously grapples with two major philosophical concepts, immanence and transcendence in his communion with God.
Okay, for the listener who hasn't encountered this jargon, let's clarify.
Transcendence, in this context, means God is utterly beyond us, separate, incomparable, outside of and superior to all creation. Immanence means God is simultaneously present within creation, active and intimately near.
And Augustine is wrestling with how a transcendent God can be immanent within the confines of his own small human heart. He asks the piercing question, what room is there within me whither my God can come into me? He sees his own limitations. How can the infinite fit into the finite?
And his answer is a radical theological concept that flips the script entirely. He realizes, I could not be, wert thou not in me. Or rather, unless I were in thee.
So he concludes that God is not a resident who moves into a human-made dwelling.
No. God is the foundational reality, the ground of being, in which all existence, including the self, subsists. Think of it like a fish in the ocean. The fish doesn't ask how the ocean can fit inside it. The fish realizes it cannot exist unless it is totally contained within the ocean.
That makes theism a requirement for existence, not just a matter of choice for salvation. You don't merely believe in God, you subsist through God.
And this philosophical depth is linked back to the personal experience of revelation, of illumination. The knowledge of God isn't reached through slow intellectual deduction alone. In his prayer, "Late have I loved thee," Augustine describes the divine light dispelling mental darkness in a revelatory moment.
Yeah.
The darkness vanished from before mine eyes, and I beheld thee, the Son of Righteousness.
Which confirms that the highest form of spiritual knowledge is a sudden, personal, overwhelming experience, a direct intervention of light into mental darkness. It validates the Eastern Church liturgy's earlier focus on illumination as a gift.
It's the ultimate antidote to the restlessness he described earlier.
And what does this entire rigorous, demanding pursuit ultimately lead to?
Ultimate tranquility. Augustine defines peace not merely as the absence of war or external strife, but as a supernatural objective state. The peace of the Sabbath, which hath no evening. An unending rest rooted solely in God. It's the ultimate promise of theistic completion.
So by the 5th century, the operational requirements of this highly developed faith, how to live rightly and what to prioritize, are solidified in liturgical prayers like those in the Gelasian Sacramentary. The theological question is no longer if God is necessary, but how to serve him perfectly.
And the Gelasian Sacramentary, a very important early service book from the mid to late 5th century, provides this powerful and comprehensive definition of service. God is described as the light of the minds that know thee, the life of the souls that love thee, the strength of the thoughts that seek thee.
Every aspect of mental, emotional, and spiritual function is sourced entirely in the divine.
And here we find that profound paradox that directly challenges modern concepts of autonomy and self-determination. The prayer concludes that the ultimate goal is to fully serve thee, whose service is perfect freedom.
This is a direct theological contradiction to secular humanism. It argues that true liberty isn't found in throwing off all external authority,
but in aligning oneself with the ultimate perfect will of the Creator. Submission is not slavery. It is the path to true autonomy. When the will of the creature aligns with the perfect will of God, constraints vanish. True freedom is achieved because you are no longer constrained by error, sin, or internal conflict.
and this fixates the believer on incorruptibility. The Leonian Sacramentary includes a plea not to mind earthly things, but to love things heavenly, and even now, while we are placed among things that are passing away, to cleave to those that shall abide.
The existential commitment is cemented. Temporary pleasures must be sacrificed for abiding eternal value.
And finally, the general petitions confirm the maturity of their conviction. They sought a peace which the world cannot give. This is a peace that transcends national quietness or lack of enemies.
It demonstrates that external chaos does not negate internal divinely granted stability. The peace they sought was supernatural, independent of external circumstances.
Wow. So we've traversed 5 intense centuries of devotional language. We've witnessed the architectural construction of early theism. The evolution is so clear. We started with the dramatic, event-based, high-stakes prayers of the New Testament.
Simeon seeing salvation, Jesus submitting his will.
Exactly. Then we moved through the radical life-or-death affirmations of the martyrs and the stringent introspection of the early liturgies, which formalized their ethical demands. And finally, we arrived at the profound philosophical struggles of Augustine, who defined the psychological and ontological necessity of God.
Yet through all this chronological movement and theological development, the core conviction remained absolutely constant. God is the singular, non-negotiable definition of reality, purpose, and eventual rest.
These prayers reveal that the earliest form of theism wasn't passive. It wasn't a source of easy comfort.
Not at all. It was a rigorous, demanding operational philosophy of life that required radical self-denial, martyrdom, intense introspection cleansing from vices and wicked thoughts, and an intellectual pursuit of infinite light and truth.
And the defining trait, established most clearly by the fathers of the 4th and 5th centuries, is that recognition that the human heart is inherently restless. It's fundamentally incomplete until it finds an objective, external, eternal source of completion.
And this necessity of the divine presence, its light, its truth, its love, is the definitive, uncompromising answer to any philosophy that claims meaning must be found solely within the temporal world or, internally manufactured by human effort.
For these foundational believers, a life without God wasn't just difficult. It was fundamentally impossible to achieve true peace, rest, or freedom.
The entire corpus of these early prayers serves as a unified declaration that the ultimate truth exists outside of and beyond the self, and the highest human endeavor is aligning the internal will with that transcendent reality.
We've heard the saints asked to be grounded in the love of Christ so they could comprehend the breadth and length and depth and height of the divine. This massive, four-dimensional pursuit of divine knowledge was their ultimate goal, the ultimate measure of reality. So when you strip away the immediate needs of your own life, the temporal, the urgent, the passing away, what is the single, non-negotiable, infinite concept that you are currently trying to measure, define, and fully comprehend? What is the objective, external reality against which you measure the peace and restlessness of your own heart? Something for you to mull over.
This has been The Deep Dive.